Hi, everyone. Welcome to session F6, Natural and Beneficial Floodplain Functions. My name is Eileen Shader. I'm Director of River Restoration for American Rivers. Apologies to anybody who has been following me around all afternoon. This is my third session in a row. I co-chair the Natural and Beneficial Functions of Floodplains Committee at ASFPM, so I'm thrilled to moderate this session. We have three fantastic speakers, and if you are into soil health, this is definitely the session for you. Our first presentation is going to be from my colleague, Olivia Dorothy. Olivia directs American River's Upper Mississippi River Program, and she also facilitates the Nicollet Island Coalition. That's a group of environmental, taxpayer, and conservation organizations focused on restoring a sustainable Upper Mississippi River. Olivia will be presenting today on nutrient retention in ecologically functional floodplains. And I would encourage everybody to please add your questions and comments to the chat as they come up, so we can collect them and pass them along to our speakers during the Q&A. With that, let's hear from Olivia.
Good afternoon. My name is Olivia Dorothy, and I am going to be speaking to you today about a paper that I recently published in the journal Water, open source journal Water, with my colleagues Brad Gordon and Chris Linhart on nutrient retention in ecologically functional floodplains. This is a literature review. I am the director of the Upper Mississippi River Basin Program for American Rivers. And if you're not familiar with American Rivers, our vision is a nation of clean, healthy water for everyone, everywhere. And to accomplish this vision, we work to protect wild rivers, restore damaged rivers, and conserve clean water for people and nature. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about nutrient retention in ecologically functional floodplains. What I'm going to cover is going to include nutrient pollution, what is it and why it's important, ecologically functional floodplains, a definition, and the results of our literature review. So nutrient pollution is a big problem in the Midwestern portion of the United States. It is a type of pollution that is found in rivers and water bodies that consist primarily of nitrogen and phosphorus. There are many impacts of nutrient pollution in our waterways that range from health impacts like nitrogen pollution in drinking water sources can interfere with your blood's ability to exchange oxygen, which can lead to a type of suffocation, especially in babies and young children. It can also cause toxic algal blooms in recreational lakes and reservoirs that can actually kill small animals and cause skin irritation in people. And probably the most well-known impact of nutrient pollution is the creation of the Gulf of Mexico dead zone at the mouth of the Mississippi River, which continues to grow in size and is significantly impacting the fishing industry off the coast of Louisiana. Nutrient pollution comes from point sources and non-point sources, like all types of water pollution. The primary point sources of nutrient pollution are wastewater treatment plants, industrial pollution like from pulp and paper mills and food and meat processing facilities specifically. And we can also get nutrient pollution from car and power plant emissions in the form of atmospheric deposition. Non-point source pollution points of nutrient pollution include fertilizer, both chemical and manure fertilizer that can be applied to agricultural fields or to your lawn. Urban stormwater, especially things like detergents that you might use to wash your car, can especially include phosphorus. And then just in general, the erosion of soil contributes significantly to the nutrient pollution problem, especially phosphorus pollution, because phosphorus is generally bound to soil particles that can be transported by water. So to reduce nutrient pollution, there are three strategies. First is trying to regulate point source discharges through things like NPDES permits, which are regulated under the Clean Water Act. The other two strategies are non-regulatory approaches. They just include minimizing application and limiting the transportation of nutrients off of the landscape. And then the third nutrient pollution reduction tool is actually the downstream removal of nutrients from the water column after they have been mobilized. And so that's where floodplain restoration fits in as a potential downstream nutrient removal tool. And so this is what we are trying to explore in this literature review. So this is really important because we know that the nutrient reduction strategies, which each state along the Mississippi River is required to adopt, are not meeting their goals. So over here we have the state of, this is Illinois on this side here, and Illinois has 45% reduction goal, 25% reduction in phosphorus, 15% reduction in nitrogen. And you can see that since we started implementing the nutrient reduction strategy in the state of Illinois, the problem has actually gotten significantly worse. Same in Iowa, which is what you see over on this side of the screen, this is nitrogen pollution from Iowa into the Mississippi River Basin, and you can see that over time it has steadily been increasing year to year. So our question was, can nutrient pollution be removed from the water column downstream through floodplain restoration by using floodplain restoration as a tool? And so to answer this question, we reviewed literature from across the United States and Europe on various floodplain restoration projects that examined nutrient removal from the water column. And in short, what we found was that the answer was yes. So healthy, ecologically functional floodplains that have been restored are very effective at removing nitrogen and phosphorus permanently from the water column. So this means that this is a very promising tool to be deployed in the Midwest, especially to help reduce nutrient pollution. So before I go any further, I'm going to back up and define what is a floodplain. Obviously, this is the conference of the Association of State Floodplain Managers, but we should all know that floodplains are defined differently in different contexts. And so our definition of the floodplain that we used for this paper was any land adjacent to a river, creek, or ditch that can become inundated with water. So we are not talking strictly about the regulated floodplain. We are talking about any land that's adjacent to a river that can become inundated with water during flood events. So what is an ecologically functional floodplain? There are three key components that make a floodplain ecologically functional. First is that there is topographic diversity as is appropriate for that ecoregion. And so what this means is that you have hills, wetlands, ponds, dips and swales across the floodplain. An ecologically functional floodplain should have native plants and wildlife and be capable of supporting native plants and wildlife that are appropriate for that ecoregion. And lastly, what's most important, that the ecologically functional floodplain is connected to the river so that it can become inundated during periods of high water following significant rain events. So how do floodplains compare in the grand scheme of all the strategies that we are using to reduce nutrient pollution in the upper Midwest? So what we found And this graph uses the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy. We modified the Iowa's graphic here to plug in floodplains where, based on what the percentage of nutrient and phosphorus removal potential was by doing floodplain restoration. And so you can see that floodplain restoration as a nutrient removal strategy is actually extremely effective when you compare it to all the other strategies that are being deployed in the landscape. And if you look at the nitrogen and phosphorus strategies, you will actually see that there's not a lot of overlap. So there's not a lot of approaches that can effectively remove nutrients from the water column and keep it out of the Mississippi River drainage basin that cross over these. Floodplains is one of the few that does actually effectively remove both nitrogen and phosphorus. So this is really important. And we have our paper went a little bit beyond just that, answering that yes or no question of whether or not floodplains can effectively remove nitrogen and phosphorus, but we actually came up with 5 recommendations to maximize nutrient removal. So if you are looking at a floodplain restoration project and are looking at restoring ecosystem functionality, we have a couple recommendations. So recommendation number 1 is that you need to slow the water down. So nitrogen, especially, the rate of removal significantly decreased as the load increased. So even though we had a linear relationship between the total amount of nitrogen that was removed from the water column versus the amount of water that was coming in, we did find that that rate of nitrogen processing decreased if the water was moving faster and as you also had more water. So it is really important to slow the water down as it is moving across the floodplain. The second recommendation is that it's really important to install a permanently inundated wetland feature on the floodplain. And by wetland, I am not talking about a pond or a reservoir. And so what a good wetland feature has a large amount of what you see here, which is this transitional zone between the the water area, the aquatic ecosystem, and the terrestrial ecosystem. And you want as much of this fringe habitat as you can possibly get. So the more fringe habitat that you have, the higher rates of especially nitrogen removal will happen in the floodplain. And this was a very, very significant difference. We saw in our literature review that floodplains that had this permanent wetland feature incorporated into their project had very, very significantly higher rates of nitrogen removal versus the floodplains that dried out completely every season. So really important recommendation. It's also really important to make sure that the floodplain has a lot of topographic diversity. This plays a big role in slowing the flow of the water down. Because basically the topography creates speed bumps. And so this increases that interaction of the water with the sediment, which is where all that bacteria are living that are going to remove the nitrogen. Slowing the water down also will allow sediment to drop off out of the water column, which, as I mentioned, most of the phosphorus is actually bound to the sediment and transported that way. And so capturing that sediment by creating these speed bumps and allowing the sediment to drop out will significantly, especially on the phosphorus side, help remove that from the water column. Our fourth recommendation is that you really need dense vegetation. This will help you slow down the water so that sediments can drop out, and it will also help promote nitrogen denitrifying bacteria that are living in that wetland fringe habitat. I hear a lot from floodplain managers that we can't put dense vegetation on floodplains because trees can block the flow of water and create dams and debris fields that back water up and can cause flooding upstream. Okay, that is fine if you live in an area and that's a concern with your floodplain restoration project, but you can create dense vegetation with shrubs and grasses and native flowers and other types of native vegetation. Because what's really important here, not just slowing that water down as it's moving across the top of the floodplain, you also need to hold that sediment in place as the water is moving across the top of it. And that can be accomplished through various deep-rooted plants, which is why, even if you are deciding that you don't want to put trees in your floodplain because of localized flood concerns, it is really strongly encouraged that you plant native vegetation. I live in the Midwest, we're the land of the tall grass prairie, so that type of habitat would be perfectly situated for promoting nutrient removal in your floodplain restoration project. Recommendation number 5 is that it's really important to do projects where it counts. And if you're in Illinois or in Iowa, this pretty much means everywhere. But basically, if you have, we all live in a world with limited funding and resources. And so it's, if you are having to pick and choose where you're going to put a floodplain restoration project with specific goals related to reducing nutrient pollution, you want to remember that linear relationship. And so put projects where you're having the biggest nutrient loads to help tackle that pollution problem and remove the sediment from the water column permanently. And then we have a tentative 6th recommendation that requires some further research. There is a suggestion that we could harvest or graze vegetation in floodplains, but there is a lot more research that's needed on this field, in this field of science, because, as we know with climate change, we're getting wetter and wetter and having more frequent flood events in the Midwest, which has a large agricultural economic presence. And so we definitely want to be looking at our floodplain farmlands and floodplain farm practices and try to figure out what are the best management activities for farmers who want to continue working their floodplain land if they don't want to take it out of production entirely. So grazing or harvesting vegetation could be a component of a floodplain restoration project that still effectively remove nitrogen from water columns during flood events. So as everyone knows here, floodplains are really important landscape features that provide many ecosystem services that benefit people, and that includes nutrient reduction and nutrient pollution filtration services. And just to kind of click through. So this is just one piece of why it is so important to look at floodplain restoration in a way that incorporates the multiple benefits, not just flood risk reduction, but also fish and wildlife habitat needs, water quality needs, economic and social justice needs, aquifer recharge or water security needs, as well as the economy and recreation. So in conclusion, floodplain restoration should definitely be used as a tool to reduce nitrogen and phosphorus in the upper Midwest, especially. And this tool should be incorporated into the state and regional nutrient reduction strategies. And with that, I thank everyone for coming to my presentation today. Here's the link. This is an open access article, so feel free to go online, download it, and check it out. And with that, I am available now to answer any questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Olivia, and such awesome research. We have a number of questions in the chat, so I will roll through those and have some of my own if we still have time. So a couple questions about start with a question of what cover crops did you find to be best in these areas?
Yeah, so the vegetation in these areas to maximize nutrient removal in your floodplain restoration project is you really want plants that are deep rooted because it will help hold that soil in place during flood events. And, in terms of cover crops, I think the next speaker is going to cover talking about healthy soils and how that impacts flooding. So I'm sure that he'll probably have a lot more information about different types of cover crops that can help with the nutrient holding potential of soils throughout the watershed. But yeah, anything that's, you want those really deep roots to help hold soil in place. It doesn't matter as much, what you see above ground as what's below ground.
And there's a question about specific target levels that we would like to see for nutrient loads reduced to. So can you talk a little bit about that, and especially within the scope of the upper Mississippi?
Yeah, and I know that I had a slide that had the targets for Illinois on it. Now I'm not remembering exactly what that is, but I think, we really need to see a very dramatic reduction in nutrient loading on the Mississippi River in the range of like 40 to 50% to make significant reductions in the size of the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, as well as to protect our own drinking water. Localized nutrient pollution concerns can vary a lot depending on the watershed and land use in the watershed. Des Moines Waterworks, some of you may know, is really struggling to meet their drinking water quality standards due to excessive levels of bacteria and nitrogen stemming from nutrient pollution.
Great. There was another question here about whether did your paper and research cover the benefits of additional soil carbon, like organics in the soil, and how that increases percolation and soil moisture holding capacity?
Yeah, so our paper only touched on that very briefly, but that certainly is true that as you build up that organic soil carbon, that you're going to improve the ability of the floodplain to transmit water from the surface into the aquifer. You're going to improve the sponginess of that floodplain, so it's going to be able to hold more water than if you didn't have that high levels of organic matter. Increasing, I think, just 1% of the soil's organic matter on an acre can increase the water holding capacity, I think, by like 20,000 gallons. It's the stats on that are pretty significant. So, again, having some of those deep-rooted plants can help increase that organic matter in the soil and increase that sponginess of your floodplain to hold more water during flood events.
I have a couple of people are curious about this. Wouldn't nutrient reduction work only when floods overflow to the ponding areas of the floodplain? What about the rest of the time?
Yeah, so it depends on the structure of the floodplain. In the Midwest, we have little creeks and streams that flow into our floodplains. And so you can still get the benefits of that nutrient reduction if your tributary is also flowing into that floodplain area prior to entering the main stem. A really good example of this is Nahant Marsh in Davenport, Iowa, where we have a very significant floodplain restoration project that does all of these things that we recommend in our paper. And the tributaries that are moving across that floodplain at that confluence point. We've done nutrient monitoring on the water that's coming into the floodplain and as it's moving across into the Mississippi River, leaving the floodplain, and we see significant reductions in nutrients. And so it's not only during flood stage, although you do want, that's definitely when it's maximized.
And do you feel that these results are transferable to a highly urbanized environment? What are your recommendations for restoring river floodplain connectivity in areas where rivers are constrained, but opportunities for setback are more limited? That's a great question.
Yeah, that is a really great question, because you do need access to that land, and it needs to be at the scale that you can get meaningful results. So if you have a really big river, you need a lot of floodplain. I work on the Mississippi River, and our floodplains are, miles across. But, in urban areas, oftentimes you're dealing with smaller creeks and streams, and you don't necessarily need as much space to get measurable results on smaller creeks and streams. Even just doing things like daylighting ditches, if it's planned intentionally, you can get results. And again, it is having that wetland feature. Having enough space to do a wetland feature is oftentimes what is the biggest constraint for a successful project that aims to actually remove nutrients. And so that can definitely be a challenge in urban areas. I have seen urban areas that have naturalized storm retention ponds to do some of these to incorporate some of these features, although I have noticed that a lot of times the goal with retention ponds is to drain them completely between flood events. And so then you lose a lot of that denitrifying bacteria that likes to live in that that fringe habitat around your wetland. So urban areas are definitely a challenge and need to be, require further results or further examination for sure.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the FEMA has put out some great resources more recently with the development of their BRIC program that are focused on helping communities to design more nature-based approaches within urban areas. And we also have we can include in the chat a link to another one of our colleagues at American Rivers has been working on some research on the economic benefits of doing setbacks in more urban areas and the various environmental benefits that can be provided, or I should say economic benefits that can be provided to communities in those situations. And that report has a lot of really great examples of the types of projects that they've been able to do in more urban areas. All right, we got a couple more questions here. I think we still have some time. So let's see, are there issues with grazing in some wet areas where the vegetation grows too fast to be nutritious for traditional livestock? I suspect this is coming from maybe Steve Samuelson getting a little in the weeds there. Unintended.
A little, literally in the weeds. Yeah, so the grazing question, definitely, I think, the harvesting of vegetation is a really great way to process phosphorus out, especially because plants like to hold that phosphorus in their structure. And so it is, looking at vegetation harvesting as particularly to accelerate the permanent removal of phosphorus pollution in floodplains is a really interesting question. The problem with it, though, is that sometimes if you're grazing or trying to do vegetation for harvesting, if you're putting in like a monoculture, you don't necessarily get those other benefits. So like you don't get the nutrient removal benefits of having, healthy soil organic matter and wetland areas. So we do need to work on developing better recommendations for farmers who either want to graze livestock in their floodplain areas, naturalize their floodplains and graze the livestock, or do some type of vegetation harvesting. So there's definitely some outstanding questions there, and that's hopefully an area of future research for myself and my colleagues, but those are some outstanding questions that came out of our paper.
One question I've been overlooking in my timeline here, any research conducted showing the nutrient pollution from duck farms? Just a little specific.
Yeah.
Thoughts on that?
I'm not sure what part of the country you live in, because duck farms can look different in different places. But I mean, ducks love wetlands in floodplains. Like if you build a wetland in a floodplain, you're going to get ducks. So it's very dependent on how the duck farm is being designed. If, you know, if you follow the 5 recommendations, you know, especially in a floodplain area where you've got a lot of space, you're going to be successful at attracting ducks to the project site. If the duck farm is highly mechanized, if it is holding excess water on the floodplain outside of what would normally be the wet stage of that floodplain in that ecoregion, it could interfere with the ability of the floodplain to process nutrients out permanently. So that is a really good question. But yeah, it very much depends on how the duck farm is being designed, because ducks generally love wetlands and floodplains, and they're always going, they're going to have a successful duck farm building these types of projects.
Here's a great question. I think we're maybe coming up on the end of time. Are you finding it difficult to couple funding sources between flood projects and natural resource projects?
Yes. The answer is yes. Yeah, it is very difficult to bridge the gray-green infrastructure divide. And, you know, we recently did an interesting feasibility study in Illinois that is looking at trying to develop a program that can provide that bridge funding. There are some states that have it, like Washington, California, Vermont. I think New York also has a program to bridge the gap between, to do more multi-benefit floodplain development projects is what we are calling them. So projects that may incorporate components of the more traditional gray infrastructure with the green infrastructure to do the ecosystem restoration in a way that's very intentional to reduce flood risk while maximizing the healthy floodplain benefits. But that's it's a big challenge.
And another one of the areas where, you know, I mentioned brick before, but we're also looking at some of the benefits of having doing integrated planning for flood projects, where we're focused on trying to identify nature-based solutions, because there's more potential for identifying multiple sources of funding. And as you know, a program like BRIC that requires a cost share or match, then being able to tap into more diverse sources of funding, say a state level program that's going to be focused on improving water quality, and match that up with flood reduction program funding, can hopefully result in more of these projects down the road. All right. All right, so let's, I think that's about our last question. It's gonna be time to move on to our next speaker. So Olivia, good job, round of applause. If anybody didn't get their questions answered in the chat, we can go through and try and come up with some answers to those. So our second presentation is going to be from Richard Aguirre, Director of West Consultants. He's developing the Land Management and Water Security Service Line. Ricardo will be presenting on building Healthy Soil to Reduce Flooding, a case study in holistic land management in Arizona. Take it away with Ricardo.
Okay, this session is about building healthy soil to reduce flooding, a case study of regenerative land management in Arizona. We will be sharing with you our Three Canyons Floodplain Management Pilot Project. My name is Ricardo Aguirre. I'm the Director of Land Management and Water Security at West Consultants. I'm also the founder of the Arizona Savory Hub. The overview for this project consists of the following. I'm going to go a little bit further into my background, discuss with some of the problems that we face today from an environmental perspective, talk about this idea of land management as an alternative to traditional engineering, and then we're going to dive into the project itself, give you the pilot project overview. Then after we discuss the pilot project, review some considerations as it relates to shift from engineering to consider land management in some cases, and then conclude with comparing management to technology. 10 years ago, my son was born, and I wanted to start considering what role I was taking as a father, and especially as a civil engineer, what type of legacy I was going to leave behind for his generation and beyond. The images that you see on the screen here had been influencing my thinking about the impact that I have as a civil engineer, especially in drainage engineering, on the environment. And I began to wonder if there's anything that I could do differently based on the things that I learned in school, as well as what I practiced as a flood control engineer. These images seem to be ever increasingly popular on mainstream media, from the large dust storms that we're facing here in the Southwest to hurricanes in the eastern seaboard and the Gulf, wildfires across the western states, and a lot of the flooding that occurs in the Midwest. Articles also are revealing changes in the environment, particularly the hydrologic cycle. Here in the Southwest, the monsoon storms are fewer, but the intensity is more extreme. Water shortages, as a result of NASA's research, are showing to be an environmental challenge for the coming century. Here is a global image of areas that are already facing freshwater losses. The bathtub ring is increasing in depth in Lake Mead. And Lake Mead is one of those reservoirs that the Bureau of Reclamation considers for rationing water in the western states, or in the states that are in the Colorado River Basin. For example, in January of 2019, under item number 3, that water surface elevation was only 1 foot above the Tier 1 water shortage set by the Bureau of Reclamation, as you can see in item number 5, upon which that rationing would affect Arizona, Nevada, California, and the Republic of Mexico. My thoughts as a civil engineer in the face of these environmental changes began in a way that I was wanting to consider what it is that I do with stormwater and floodwater, because I was trained to treat it as a nuisance. And you'll see in this video here that others are beginning to treat stormwater and floodwaters as a resource, the way nature long has done. So what I'm going to do is play a little over a minute of this video, and that's going to set the tone for the rest of the presentation, because it's in this space of regenerative agriculture that these gentlemen are speaking of that I have considered to bring up and over and explore in engineering projects from a flood control perspective. It's going to take a few minutes or a few moments to key up. Let me go ahead and get it started here.
Civilization.
Many have thought restoring large amounts of carbon to soil would take centuries. These folks only need a decade, and maybe less.
Last month we did soil tests on our operation, and what we found is that we've over tripled the amount of organic matter, in other words, the amount of carbon stored in our soils.
Carbon-rich soils soak up heavy rainfall. Carbon-depleted soils don't.
When there was quite a bit of rain, the water would run down the hill and there would be water laying in the bottom of that slough. And now I get better water infiltration. That doesn't happen to me anymore.
In 1993, we could only infiltrate 1/2 inch of rainfall per hour. Now we can infiltrate over 8 inches of rainfall per hour. Think of the ramifications of that. I tell people it's not how much moisture and rainfall you get, it's how much can your soils hold.
Because carbon-rich soils hold on to water, they help the ranchers weather droughts.
This was seeded 8 weeks ago, and it's only seen 38/100ths an inch of rainfall. Yet look how healthy it is.
The way that we graze these cattle and run these cattle, and with the help.
Okay, so not only is infiltrating water helping ranchers through their drought leg, but it also has the potential of helping flood control, as you'll see in the following slides. What these ranchers are doing is practicing a land management technique called holistic land planning, developed by Alan Savory. I recommend that you consider looking at that last video in its full extent. The name of it, Soil Carbon Cowboys, as well as the video that you see to the lower left by Alan Savory's TED Talk. The Savory Institute, by his namesake, is a global initiative to restore the world's grasslands, to train ranchers and farmers, like you just heard, to practice regenerative agricultural techniques to help restore grasslands, as well as performance and production and carrying capacity of their livestock. The organization largely is developed to promote this decision-making framework, much like lean management or Six Sigma. But what's different about holistic management is that it considers the environment as one of the decision-making factors. And in the training, it consists of these areas or these modules. And even though it's rooted in land management, it's not restricted to land management. You can actually use this to make decisions in a family or other areas, but it just happens to consider the environment. Obviously, it's also heavily used for managing land as well, because land is the directly influences how humans operate and function and survive on Earth. Here are some proven results of holistic management worldwide. And you can see here the before and after in Australia, the before and after in Mexico, the before and after in Zimbabwe. I actually visited this location several years ago. This is Alan Savory's ranch. And what you don't see here is the speed upon which nature responded to proper land management. The left was a picture taken in September of 2004. And only 2 years later, in September 2006, the response of these plants, grasses, forbs, and legumes have occurred. Fence line shot in South Africa, comparing conventional grazing to holistic plan grazing on the left. Here is an image of what the global hub network looks like. And again, this hub network is developed to restore the world's grasslands. It also consists of land managers accredited, who are accredited professionals like myself, to be able to deploy this decision-making framework of holistic management. As I indicated, I am the founder of the Arizona Savory Hub here in Arizona, and that's what the relationship that we have to the land to be able to promote these practices to both the public and private sector. Now, what we're going to be doing is sharing with you the project in Cochise County about the work that we're doing under a holistically managed program. Before we get there, though, I want to spend a little time about what land used to look like less than 200 years ago. To do that, we have an image of a wagon wheel trail that was commissioned to be traveled by a gentleman, a Lieutenant Beale for the Army, to go from Albuquerque to California. It's roughly the Interstate 40 alignment. Now, what Beale did is he wrote in his journal every time they went to a camp. They camped for the night. And in 1857, this was his journal entry near McCarty's, New Mexico. And what you see here is he journaled observing finest green grass, streams quite narrow, nowhere over 6 feet, water is clear, full of fish. The grass was high enough to reach the belly of the mules, but plenty of grass for his animals to eat. The author of this book, called Along the Beale Trail, was Milton Snow, a photographer. He took Beale's journal and went back to these camp locations 81 years later to take a photographic account to compare it against what Beale had journaled. The following slide shows the enormity of soil loss that have occurred, so much so that this once small 6-foot wide stream has now been incised of approximately 20 to 25 feet, as you can see with the gentleman standing at the embankment bottom. No way for the floodway to access the floodplain, and no grasses in the uplands on the floodplain either. At the same time, William Hornaday in 1875 was observing the massive amounts of grazing animals that the land was able to carry. In this case, 25 miles wide, 50 miles deep, a great herd of buffalo. So how is nature managing herself to be able to have the carrying capacity of all those animals? So what Alan Savory discovered is that there is a predator-prey relationship, a natural intelligence in management, as it were, that led to the perennial grasses across the western states that was able to support these large herds of buffalo and, of course, their predators that managed them. What Alan Savory then had proposed was to borrow from that natural intelligence and the predator-prey relationship and use livestock as a proxy to those former grazing animals, and in this case humans as the former predators, to be able to move and manage those animals bunching and moving with mobile fencing. Land management in a nutshell when it comes to using livestock is really the use of animal impact, the dunging, the urinating, and the trampling of plants, grazing not to be confused with overgrazing, but rather manage grazing to benefit plant diversity and health. And then also rest, not to be confused with too much rest or even partial rest, which in arid climates, less spoken about, but even worse than overgrazing, rest adversely impacts the land, but rest is still important. But it's just enough rest before the plants recover and the need for them to be grazed again. So these are the key features that we are exploring in our land management practices and certainly on this pilot project. To describe the difference between the traditional or conventional approach to grazing, it basically consists of few animals, large areas for long periods of time, months to years. And I know this firsthand because before I went to engineering school, I grew up on a ranch, and this is exactly what we did. Holistic plan grazing is about actively managing animals, and many of them, and concentrating them in small areas in little periods of time, small periods of time, hours to days. And you get the results that you see on the right. So this is what we're proposing to do. The image that you see on the left is the existing conditions of our Three Canyons site. And you can see it's a textbook example of what I just described. One cow, there's actually 24 more cows, but the area that they're grazing is 480 acres, very large area. And these animals have been there, according to the Cochise County, approximately 15 to 20 years. You can see the dung in the foreground that has not been worked back into the soil. This area is only a mile away from the San Pedro. And this dung is a source for E. coli contaminating the San Pedro River. So even water quality is an area of concern when the land is not managed properly. And of course, we're proposing to go take this land and improve it to what you see on the right. The picture on the right was actually in the Soil Carbons Cowboy, and I've had the fortune of getting to know Gabe Brown, who was featured in that video. And he invited me to his farm. I was able to see for myself the dramatic effect of what he's done using animal impact on his croplands as he interchanged livestock activity with croplands. But the point here from a flood control standpoint is that his farm, as he purported in the video I just shared with you, was able to soak up or infiltrate 13.2 inches in 6 hours the day before. And you can see in the background where the depressions are, there's no evidence of ponding. He built his farm up to the soil organic matter of 5%, whereas the picture on the left, which is actually behind where the picture is taken on the right, so a neighboring adjacent farm practicing conventional farming still has soil organic matter at 1.7%. And a mere half-inch rainfall the day before could not even be infiltrated the following day. At this point, as a flood control engineer, this was one of the aha moments that I had in considering this approach to flood control and this relationship between soil organic matter and soil water holding capacity, where it's been reported in research that on average 1% of soil organic matter can retain up to 20,000, or rather at a minimum of 20,000 gallons, but I've seen some research showing that it could be up to as much as 60,000 gallons of water per acre. This is a picture of Omaha, and if I personally think that it's reasonable that if many, or let's say most of the ranchers and farmers practicing regenerative agriculture the way that Gabe Brown did in North Dakota, that Omaha may have not had this effect of flooding. So let's get into the pilot project. Here's the overview. As an engineer, I considered my experience in design engineering, and I developed a 3-phase approach to this project, where phase 1 is the restoration concept phase. And in that phase, we had determined the existing conditions. We took soil samples. We also did some initial ecological monitoring to determine what kind of plants existed out there, certain soil life, as well as this existing small fauna and flora, or excuse me, some small fauna on the site. And with that information, we proceeded to develop a land plan alternative as a result of going through a preliminary alternatives development process to identify the recommended alternative. With that, we moved into phase 2 to actually install the improvements. And within that phase, we further researched the material, developed more detailed cost estimates, and then we proceeded to construct the site. We have now started phase 3 of the project. And with phase 3, we are going to be conducting a soil biology plan so we get a clear understanding of what the soil conditions are, of course, monitoring and recording so that we could be able to report to the scientific community the effects of land management and improving soil have on, in particular, flood control, but also using that flood water as a resource. And then, of course, we're going to be conducting contract grazing management with a local rancher and using his cattle. Here is a plan view of the watershed. The watershed is going from west to east, coming from the Huachuca Mountains down into the Piedmont, and determinus is the San Pedro River. Our pilot project site is demarcated in the 3/4 section in red. We use the Flow2D model to determine the 100-year 6-hour event as the design event. And you can see that there are roughly 3 water courses flowing through the site. The existing conditions model then was tweaked to create a theoretical proposed conditions by changing 2 input parameters: the soil organic matter percentage and the limiting infiltration depth. The soil organic matter was increased from the 1.7 that actually existed on this site, similar to Gabe's neighboring farmer, to 5% to reflect what Gabe had achieved at the time of those photos that I showed to you in previous slides. And we also increased the limiting infiltration depth from 8 inches to 10 feet to reflect the ecological succession from annual plants to perennial plants, which have a much deeper root depth, upwards of 30 feet, but we decided to keep it at 10 feet to be a little bit more on the conservative side. But these root depths have been shown to be pathways for surface water to infiltrate into the ground. What I think is important here is to show, though, once we ran that model, is the difference between the downstream flow rates. If, let's say, we take a look at the northernmost cross section of 1,511 cubic feet per second in the existing conditions, and the dramatic infiltration effect in the northernmost cross section under the theoretical proposed conditions of 108 cubic feet per second. A difference of about 1,400 cubic feet per second. We looked at the hydrograph of those two cross sections and we subtracted one from the other, which is the potential recharge at that one cross section location, and came up with approximately 227 acre feet. So from a modeling perspective, this is a clear case of treating floodwaters, stormwater, as a resource and not a nuisance in some flood control facility using expensive concrete and steel. So for our pilot project, we're proposing to go from what's on the top to what's on the bottom. And as I indicated before, it's about getting these perennial plants in the forms of grasses, forbs, and legumes to grow their root structure into the ground and break up this hard pan layer that we know exists out there, because that property has been farmed for 10 to 15 years as an alfalfa production in center pivot irrigation. So that was very hard on the land, and it created a very hard compaction layer. With animal impact, especially cattle, we are expecting to break up that compaction layer and allow these root structures to set themselves in. From a crude perspective, we have conducted a infiltration test using shovel. This is in a different location, still in Arizona, still in southern Arizona. And in this case, we used sheep bunched in a very small cage to make sure that they were actively treating the land with hoof action, ultra high density. Stock density is what it would be referred to as, and just one treatment of sheep in this area. Now, this was before the first rain of the year, the first heavy rain of the year. These two shovel dig locations were only 3 feet away. The cage was approximately 3 feet by 9 feet, and you could see how easy the shovel, according to our ranch manager, went into the ground. He said it just slid right in. But 3 feet away, where there was no animal impact, he said he had to jump on the shovel, and it only went in a few inches. So let's now look at some considerations about this idea of using a nature-based approach like land management to control flooding, as opposed to the concrete and steel and centralizing of stormwater or floodwaters, the way that I was trained in school and practiced as a professional engineer. This is certainly a new approach to recharging groundwater, as well as also controlling floods. The need to continually promote this idea to officials like Cochise County, I think, is also incredibly important. But to be able to point to projects like this that Cochise County has had the vision to do, and to be able to explore for other local, state, and federal governments to consider. Drought is a consideration, but at some point it's going to rain, and we just need to be prepared for that rainfall to make that rainfall more effective once it hits the land. The human condition is a major challenge, I believe, because the human condition is so used to one and done technology treatments. It's become very easy, even though it's very expensive, to deploy technological practices such as large flood control infrastructure, then be done with it and assume it's going to work and hold up to that next design event. So it's going to require a discipline to change that paradigm thinking into more of a land management approach. Watershed boundaries and property boundaries are not the same, but this is a minor condition, a minor issue, and holistic management is a framework to solve that. Computer drainage models, they're good in theory, and it gives us a target to shoot for, but it's not the real story. We're going to need to go out and monitor and be able to report that monitoring effectively to the scientific community to be able to verify that the water is actually being controlled, but it's been done. The ability to develop observation skills is also critically important, particularly with plant recovery. And I mentioned already the probability of its success. I've already showed those slides worldwide. The success is achievable. Management versus technology. So the image on the right is a project that I was an engineer of record on. It's a 15-acre retention detention basin facility, multi-million dollars, requires continual maintenance, actually $12 million to be specific. The only benefit was actually just symptomatic relief in flood control and groundwater recharge, because I decided to leave the base of the bottoms of these basins earthen. The image on the right is what we're piloting with Cochise County, or rather because of Cochise County and their vanguard spirit and willingness to explore these approaches in land management as an alternative to flood control engineering. And to date, we have not even spent $1 million. So these are multi-six-figure projects at best. And it does require continual management in this case, but the benefits are bundled in many ways. Of course, flood control through increasing infiltration, the benefit of recharging and offering long-term water security for the area, water quality mitigation, as I indicated for the San Pedro River, the soil loss also will be improved dramatically, also improving dust mitigation, the control of wildfires, invasive species, and other symptoms of certification will be likely resolved. Here's a final slide that I have for you, which is the NRCS exhibit at a fair, and they're showing the dramatic changes that affects soil loss as well as flooding just with these small jars. Where there's 0% cover, you've got an enormous amount of sediment in the flow regime. And then moving from 30 to 50 to 70 and finally 100%, and you see that there is practically little to no runoff. What little runoff there is, it's clear. So this is the end of the presentation. If you'd like to, I'll answer questions as best as I can. If for some reason I don't get to all the questions, please email Mariko or myself, or actually both of us, and we'll see what we can do to reply to your questions. You can also go to the West Consultants website and learn more about what we do. And then also the Arizona Savory Hub website is soon to be live. So that's all I have. Thanks.
Right. Thank you, Ricardo. That was an awesome presentation. I definitely learned a lot. It was really valuable. I have a handful of questions in the chat, so and a few minutes to get through them. So we'll try and hit as many as possible. First is, are you finding support from the Department of Agriculture and local extension agencies for this type of land management? Is this community talking with the floodplain managers within the community?
Well, the short answer is yes. We are actually working with large NRCS projects under the USDA, under their PL 566 program, which is their Watershed Protection Flood Prevention Act. And in terms of local, getting the word out to the other local communities, that is ongoing. Other counties have been interested in the work that we're doing in Cochise County.
And are you able to integrate these practices into a traditional row crop or haying operation versus grazing?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, we that's actually we have another pilot project in a little bit further north, and we are exploring, cover crops, moving into more edibles, and then rotating animals in so that we can, affect those more in the Midwest as opposed to the Southwest that are, largely farm dominated areas.
Have you done any research into whether these regenerative agriculture practices extend the life of aquifers?
Well, that's what this pilot project is about. We've got 2 wellheads, so we're going to be taking water surface elevations of the groundwater and begin to, again, be able to communicate that to the scientific community. Just logically thinking, this is, these aquifers used to be artesian, especially along the riparian areas back when again, Beale came across the land. So I don't see why we couldn't do that again just by affecting the land the same way, just with livestock this time.
Yeah. Are there any incentives you're aware of that are being provided to ranchers other than the inherent benefits to encourage them to adopt these more holistic practices?
The incentives are something that I've been talking to at least the state about and trying to put that out there through various state agencies. I think the incentive right now could be coming through the NRCS on these projects from on a federal level, but I don't know of any per se, but I really think that that would encourage that process. And I will say also, there is also a kind of a drive to pay farmers to sequester carbon. So that could be an incentive to kind of look at a bank, whether it's carbon or nitrogen or water.
Yeah. And actually what is occurring to me and what I was thinking of during your presentation is there's so much discussion of, how we define infrastructure now and all these infrastructure bills, and how, and if there's room in a way that we can consider sort of our watersheds, the natural soil as a component of our infrastructure systems, because you say it's an alternative to the much bigger structures that we tend to invest in. So I think it's the work you're doing is really contributing to that sort of conversation. So thank you so much for this presentation. I thought it was wonderful.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
And sorry for everybody whose questions we didn't have time to get to. We need to move on to our third presentation. So round of applause for Ricardo. And our final speaker is going to be Tim Harrison with Woodard and Curran, excuse me. Tim is a registered civil engineer with 19 years of experience in design, construction management, flood protection, watershed studies, master planning, and grant applications. And Tim will be presenting on letting nature take its course, integrated improvements and avoidance measures to achieve flood protection with reduced maintenance. So Tim, take it away.
Thank you for attending this session. My name is Tim Harrison with Woodard and Curran, and I'll be presenting a case study today titled Letting Nature Take Its Course. It's based on a major flood protection project that attempted to minimize short and long-term impacts during the course of construction and post-construction activities. The project is Santa Clara Valley Water District's Upper Llagas Flood Protection Project. It consists of about 14 miles of flood protection improvements. The project site is located southeast of San Francisco and San Jose in California. The upper reaches are characterized by being more urban in the city of Morgan Hill, whereas the lower reaches are much more rural and agricultural. The upstream end of the project has flooding on an annual or biannual basis. The channel is definitely undersized for the 1% event, whereas the downstream reaches are significantly larger and typically can convey between a 5 and 10-year event. The flood protection goals for this project were to provide 1% protection for the upper reaches in the more urban areas, whereas avoiding inducement of flooding in the lower agricultural reaches. In order to achieve the outcomes shown on this slide, the design team really focused on an integrated design that focused on the conveyance aspects of the project as well as the geomorphology, habitat, and long-term maintenance. All of these elements can impact and are impacted by the others, so getting an early handle during the design phase on how these were related were key to an efficient implementation of the design and a really positive project outcome. The approaches used for the design focused on these three main areas shown here: the conveyance, geomorphological, and habitat approaches. The conveyance approaches were focused on achieving those flood protection goals and making sure that as we were building those channels, we were accounting for the space that the techniques to be employed in the other areas would have room to fit into the project design. The geomorphological approaches focused on mimicking the natural form and design and function of natural channels. These techniques were based on observation of the August Creek as well as other similar creeks in the area, as well as sediment and stability modeling and profile monitoring over time to check how quickly and in which areas the channel was still incising. The habitat approaches focused on avoiding loss of high-value habitat, reuse of materials where possible. This includes bedload material, topsoil, and trees and woody vegetation, and really looking for opportunities for enhancement through creation of new habitats, looking to enhance the native plant populations, and improving existing habitats. The design of the project really focused on the location of the project, what the characteristics of the stream were at that location, and the project requirements for that location. So here in the upstream area, in the Morgan Hill area, this area is characterized by being more urban, having very narrow constrained channels and no anadromous fish. Considerations for the design were to avoid impacts to the property owners wherever possible, minimizing impacts to the commercial center, and recognizing that the existing channel was undersized. And what the design team realized is, as you can see, as the channel makes its way through the downtown area, this channel really was very constrained by being in backyards, next to commercial areas, actually passing underneath Main Street, being underneath parking lots, working its way between buildings. And so as we were working through how we could improve the capacity of this channel, we realized that we weren't going to get there by working with the existing stream, and we needed to develop a high flow bypass around this very congested area of the stream. This high flow bypass would minimize disruption to the riparian environment, local residents and businesses, and allow the existing stream functions and benefits to continue. The bypass itself ended up being nearly a mile long. It's about 2,400 linear feet of 10-foot by 9-foot double box culvert, and it transitions into and out of about 2,400 feet of horseshoe-shaped tunnel. It's about 12 feet tall by 14 feet wide. And as you can see up at the top of the photo there, the flow actually splits at a weir diversion structure. Low flows are kept within a pipeline that was sized to limit flow to be the capacity of the downstream creek, where the higher flows are diverted over a weir into those box culverts. After passing through the tunnel, it transitions back into box culverts before it is reintroduced into the stream. The downstream area had very different characteristics and project needs. This is definitely a more rural agricultural area with more open space available. There are anadromous fish and habitat considerations throughout the project. The team really wanted to reduce mitigation and maintenance wherever possible through these areas, as well as identify opportunities for enhancement. Early in the project, the geomorphology and habitat subject matter experts met with the hydraulic modelers to provide input as to the form and function of the creek and how they envisioned the project unfolding. This allowed the early hydraulic models to account for features such as the bankful channels, sediment deposition, and high levels of roughness, and kind of start us off in the right foot. And then this was an iterative process so that as additional information was developed and refined, that could feed back into the model. But at least we had a good starting point for understanding what the project cross-sections might look like. So that really allowed us to build in features such as preserved banks and vegetations, the bankful channels. We had benches built into the project from the outset that would allow for not only capacity, but also to allow that bankful channel to meander within the project footprint and increase our opportunity for mitigation space. And then the engineered slopes, basically everywhere we were excavating, was an opportunity to harvest natural materials such as the topsoil so that we could reuse that later in the project. Like I said, as understanding what that future vegetation and sediment loading might look like allowed that model to account for very high roughnesses and a fair amount of sediment deposition, allowing us to reduce the maintenance requirements of the project. When you understand what the creek wants to do, that means that you won't be fighting it for the entire life of the project. So what you see here on the left is an early sketch of the geomorphological preference for bank relaxation. And that allowed us to balance that design driver against other factors such as vegetation removal or land use constraints. And we're able to have that discussion early on in the project. Understanding the natural meander of the creek also helps us to diagnose issues that are currently happening on the creek. On the right, you can see in 1939, the Llagas Creek was crossing the street twice, but by 2018, the creek had been straightened, causing some maintenance issues, ongoing maintenance issues for Valley Water. But by understanding what the creek had done in the past, it allowed us to build in solutions into the current project design to reduce or potentially even eliminate the maintenance issues at the creek here. The characteristics of the creek suggested that we could actually build in features to reduce in-stream maintenance in the future. We did this by building sediment banks, which are really just wide spots in the creek at convenient locations where sediment can fall out during most years, and then during years where the creek is more sediment starved, it has a place to go back and find that loose sediment rather than digging it out of the banks and the channel bottoms. This prevents excessive buildup of sediment in places where it is less convenient to have that sediment building up, and avoids the need for channel maintenance and bank restoration in the future. By limiting excavation to one side of the creek channel, the designers really have the opportunity to select which vegetation we're going to save. In the case of the Upper Llagas project, there was a strong preference to preserve the valley oaks and California sycamores. You can see that by, in this location, we achieved that by excavating on the channel bank opposite them. A project like this also allows us to remove less desirable species like the invasive Himalayan blackberry and Arundodonyx, which we're doing in this particular location on the project. One of the neat things that the client was able to do for this project was to actually create on-site nurseries of genetically pure strains of the preferred vegetation. And so that we see here in the photo on the left is part of the lab experiment, trying to figure out which media grows the cuttings the best. And these cuttings were then transferred to those nurseries for incorporation into the project design. When there's an interest in incorporating these types of integrated natural solutions into the project, there's oftentimes a willingness to think a little bit outside of the box. This provides an opportunity for the project team to provide enhancement opportunities and not just mitigation and impact avoidance measures. So here are two locations where we were able to do this on the Upper Llagas project. On the left, you see a former vegetable processing facility. On the southern side of the creek, there is the packaging and processing side, and on the northern side of the creek is the wastewater treatment ponds. So what we did as part of the project was turn those ponds into a high flow bypass area where we have some pretty varied environments for different types of vegetation to grow in, and allows us to supplement the capacity of the existing creek and avoid those in-stream impacts in this, one of the more high value riparian areas along the project. And then on the south side, the client is actually planning to turn this site into a staging and maintenance area. And then over on the right, in the past, the creek had been rerouted into an abandoned quarry lake that was causing a barrier to fish migration and bringing in a lot of invasive species, both plant and animal. So as part of the project, we were able to restore the historic alignment of the channel and limit the water supply to that quarry lake. And we were also able to take some of the spoils excavated from elsewhere on the project and bring those into the project site here, reducing the project cost a little bit, but also creating a multi-tiered wetland that's a really nice environmental feature for the project to incorporate into its design. So prior to getting to my closing thoughts, I did want to share some photos of construction. You can see in one of these photos the in-stream complexities, some of the log root wad boulder structures that utilize trees that needed to be removed from the project footprint. So we were excited to be able to keep those within the project and utilized locally. You can also see one of the island features that I mentioned previously. You know, the natural meander going around to the left, the historic channel is just off screen to the right. And you can see the preparation for the plantings that we're going to be putting into within the creek itself. And then down at the bottom of the page is a shot of one of the on-site nurseries that's growing the native vegetation. So in closing, I did want to emphasize a couple of thoughts for you. Primarily that early planning for these natural features and approaches can lead to better project outcomes. When you start planning for these early in the process, you can really achieve a lot of design efficiencies rather than going back and circling back to incorporate them into the design later, or feeling like you're trying to shoehorn in these features and benefits at the end. It allows for more complete integration of these elements and benefits. There are a lot of things, a lot of natural approaches that can be applied to a project like this, or really any other type of project. We've talked about a couple of the ones that we did on this on the Upper Yagas project, but those approaches are really driven by your project considerations. And a couple that I would strongly emphasize that people keep in mind as you move through your own projects are to keep in mind the current and planned use of the land that you're working through and around. Always keep in mind the in-stream and terrestrial habitats. We certainly focused more on the in-stream in this presentation, but the terrestrial habitats are extremely important as well. Understanding the geomorphically stable state of your channel is going to reduce long-term maintenance requirements, as well as give you a more stable channel that won't tend to deviate from the planned project footprint as much. Of course, you need to keep in mind what your flood protection goals are and what conveyance capacities you need to achieve as part of your projects. And also just keep in mind the type and frequency of maintenance that you want to incorporate into your long-term plan. That'll impact your long-term costs, as well as some of the permitting requirements that may be imposed on the project. This concludes my presentation. My contact information is available on the screen, and I look forward to chatting with you during the Q&A session or anytime after. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Tim, for that presentation. That was great. Reminder to folks, please add your questions to the Q&A if you have any for Tim. I have a couple. I was wondering if you'd talk about your clients for this project and what went into evaluating the design decisions about channel alignment and bank excavation.
Yeah, so we actually had a really broad cross-section of the staff at Valley Water helping out with this project. It included the kind of project management capital improvement team. There was the maintenance staff were certainly involved. We also had arborists and planners and fisheries biologists all contributing really from the outset of the project all the way through the bid documents. You know, the PM and CIP group were looking at the big picture, kind of integration of everything. They were concerned about the project costs, impacts to the project owners, and really brought a really good understanding of the history of the concerns that residents have had with the creek, with flooding, with development in the area. The maintenance staff were obviously looking at it from a long-term maintenance perspective for both sediment removal as well as vegetation management and channel stability. The arborist was very helpful in determining, what are really the high value species, both from a species perspective, but also for kind of overall ecological health, where there are particular stands that and patches of vegetation that we did that were, nothing's ever preferable to remove, but we choosing between the least of the evils. The planners were certainly involved from a permittability and mitigation standpoint, thinking about how the negotiations with regulatory agencies were going to go. And then the fisheries biologists were very interested in kind of reusing the in-stream resources, all the bedload materials, understanding kind of what habitats were currently afforded to the fish species that were there, and looking to see how we could kind of use this project to create a channel form that was helpful and beneficial for the species moving forward, and also how do we create additional habitat features and bring in those in-stream complexities. So it was really a pretty comprehensive team effort with a lot of different perspectives, and we were fortunate to be able to get that input and perspective from all of them.
Sorry, muted myself. I had my dog was making noise in the background, but saying it sounds very multidisciplinary, which is awesome to see. Had a question. Oh, I lost it here. There's somebody from Valley Water in the audience who wanted to say how cool it was to see one of their projects featured.
Fantastic.
And also a question from Brian about whether there were any right-of-ways or land acquisition required for the project.
Yeah, there are actually quite a few. Obviously there's, when you start with a channel that's not big enough, you're going to need to expand it out a little bit. So I think there were on the order of 175 land acquisitions that needed to happen along the way. Specifically as a result of our design, the district had actually been acquiring property over the last couple decades. The project was originally a soil conservation service project back in the 50s. And so there had always been this vision for what the channel might look like. And then when we stepped in to do the final design, we were able to tweak that. But Valley Water had been acquiring property along the way as it became available, kind of with the vision of that they were eventually going to be building this project. So yeah, there was quite a bit of land acquisition involved.
Yeah. Can you talk about the community engagement process and how sort of outreach to landowners went and how that proceeded?
Sure, yeah. Basically, as we were working on the design, we were working with the client to minimize those land impacts wherever we could. Then as we got into it and we're really finalizing the footprint, basically it was a lot of one-on-one interaction. The client was local and knew a lot of the residents that we needed to talk to anyway. So he was able to really speak to them on a personal level and explain to them kind of the process of the project and show what we had been doing and what all the considerations were that had gone into this alignment and why we were coming to them to ask for that property, and making sure that people understood the basis and background of the project and really getting into kind of building a consensus around the importance of the project.
Great. I think we have time for one more question from Laura about, did you do any restoration work in the urban upstream section, or did the flow bypass improve by itself. So
We did not do any in-stream restoration.
mhm.
It was one of those things where to have gone into that area and tried to do restoration in that confined area would have triggered a lot of additional permitting. And so we wanted to kind of stay hands off in that area since it was so impacted by the urban environment anyway. We were more interested in avoiding those impacts than creating more.
Gotcha. And when was the project completed?
It's actually ongoing.
It's ongoing. Okay, cool. I was going to ask how the stream was responding to the project, but still to be determined, I guess.
Yeah, the construction was actually broken into 3 phases. Phase 1 is wrapping up. It's been about 2 years in construction now. And then the second phase is just starting. So the work that's been done was focused on the lower reaches. And the next phase of the project will actually do the tunnel work through the downtown area and some of those box culverts.
Gotcha. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much, Tim. That was a really fascinating presentation, and maybe you can come back in a few years and let us know how it's all working out.
That'd be great.
So thank you everyone who was able to join us today. Really appreciate you showing up for this last session of the day. And if you are still feeling like you'd want to enjoy more ASFPM virtual fun, there's a happy hour starting pretty soon. And perhaps we will see some of you over there. If not, thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your conference.